When Jessica Martinez first walked through the front door of the Coleman family's pristine suburban home in Denver, she had no idea she was stepping into a situation that would change everything she believed about trust, family, and the secrets people hide behind closed doors. What started as a simple nanny job for the successful real estate executive turned into something far more complex when the hidden security cameras revealed conversations and behaviors that nobody was supposed to see. By the time Jessica handed in her resignation letter after just 24 hours, the footage had already captured enough evidence to turn this family's world completely upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jessica Martinez adjusted her navy blue cardigan as she stood on the front steps of 4127 Maple Ridge Drive, checking the address on her phone one final time. The Tudor-style house loomed before her with its perfectly manicured lawn and gleaming white picket fence, exactly the kind of upscale neighborhood where she'd built her reputation as one of Denver's most trusted childcare providers over the past 8 years. At 32, Jessica had worked with dozens of families throughout Colorado, from tech entrepreneurs in Boulder to oil executives in Fort Collins. Her references were impeccable, her background checks spotless, and her approach with children had earned her glowing recommendations that kept her booked months in advance. The Coleman family had specifically requested her services after hearing about her work from the Hendersons, another wealthy family in the same neighborhood. The front door opened before she could ring the doorbell, revealing Victoria Coleman, a tall, blonde woman in her late 30s wearing a crisp white blazer and an expression that seemed perpetually rushed. "Jessica, thank goodness you're here. I'm already running behind schedule." Victoria's handshake was firm but brief, her attention already divided between Jessica and the phone buzzing incessantly in her other hand. "Mrs. Coleman, it's wonderful to meet you in person," Jessica replied warmly, following Victoria through an entryway decorated with expensive artwork and fresh flowers. The house smelled like vanilla candles and furniture polish, every surface spotless and arranged with magazine-perfect precision. "Please, call me Victoria. And this chaos you're walking into, it's temporary, I promise." Victoria gestured vaguely toward the living room, where toys were scattered across the hardwood floor, the only sign that children actually lived in this showcase home. "My previous nanny, Margaret, had a family emergency and had to leave suddenly last week. Since then, it's been absolute mayhem trying to juggle everything myself." Jessica nodded understandingly as she absorbed the layout of the home. Floor-to-ceiling windows let in streams of morning sunlight, illuminating a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a home design show. Everything was white marble and stainless steel, with not a single smudge or fingerprint visible anywhere. "Tell me about Emma and Dylan," Jessica said, setting down her tote bag filled with activities and educational games. "I know from our phone conversation that Emma is 6 and Dylan is 4. But I'd love to hear more about their personalities and routines." Victoria's expression softened slightly as she poured coffee from an expensive espresso machine. "Emma is incredibly bright, probably too smart for her own good sometimes. She's reading at a 3rd-grade level and constantly asking questions about everything. Dylan is more of our free spirit. He's energetic, loves building things, but he can be challenging when it comes to following directions." As if summoned by the mention of their names, 2 children appeared at the top of the curved staircase. Emma had her mother's blonde hair pulled back in neat braids, wearing a purple dress that looked like it had been pressed that morning. Dylan, with darker hair like his father's, wore khaki pants and a polo shirt, though one corner was already untucked. "Emma, Dylan, come meet Miss Jessica," Victoria called up to them. "She's going to be taking care of you while Mommy is at work." Emma descended the stairs with careful, measured steps, while Dylan bounded down 2 at a time, nearly tripping over his own feet in the process. "Are you going to stay longer than the last lady?" Emma asked with the directness that only children possess. "I certainly hope so," Jessica replied, crouching down to meet them at eye level. "What happened with the last lady?" "She cried a lot," Dylan announced matter-of-factly. "Daddy said she wasn't a good fit for our family." Victoria's coffee mug paused halfway to her lips, and Jessica noticed a brief flash of something. Annoyance, concern, crossed the woman's features before she quickly recovered. "Children say the most unexpected things, don't they? Margaret was lovely, but sometimes these arrangements just don't work out for various reasons." Jessica made a mental note of the exchange, but kept her expression neutral and welcoming. In her years of experience, she'd learned that children often revealed important information about family dynamics without realizing it, and the adults' reactions to those revelations could be equally telling. "Well, I'm excited to get to know both of you better," Jessica said to the children. "I brought some fun activities we can do together, and I heard you both love stories." Emma's eyes lit up immediately. "What kind of stories?" "I just finished reading Charlotte's Web all by myself." "That's impressive." "I have some chapter books we might enjoy together, and maybe we could even write our own story," Jessica suggested, already sensing Emma's enthusiasm for learning. Dylan tugged on Jessica's cardigan. "Can we build a fort?" "Margaret never wanted to build forts." "Forts are definitely something we can work on," Jessica assured him. Ruffling his hair gently, Victoria glanced at her watch, a thin gold Cartier that caught the light as she moved. "I really do need to get going. I have a closing at 9:30 that I absolutely cannot miss." She grabbed a leather briefcase from the counter and began rattling off instructions rapid fire. "Emma's lunch is already packed in the refrigerator, the pink lunchbox. Dylan will eat almost anything, but no peanuts anywhere in the house because Emma has a severe allergy. The emergency numbers are on the refrigerator. My cell phone, Charles's office, poison control, pediatrician. The children's schedules are printed out and taped to the pantry. Door." Jessica tried to absorb all the information while also watching the children's reactions to their mother's hurried departure preparations. Emma stood quietly, her hands clasped behind her back, while Dylan had already lost interest and was examining a decorative bowl on the coffee table. "One more thing," Victoria said, lowering her voice slightly and leaning closer to Jessica. "Charles, my husband, he works from home most days. His office is upstairs at the end of the hall, and he prefers not to be disturbed during business hours. He's got some important deals closing this week, so he'll probably be on conference calls quite a bit." "Of course, I completely understand," Jessica replied. "We'll make sure to keep our activities downstairs and quiet." Victoria grabbed her keys from a hook by the garage door, then paused, looking back at Jessica with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "I know this is a lot to take in on your first day. Margaret was with us for almost 2 years, so there's definitely an adjustment period when someone new comes in. The children might seem a bit unsettled at first. That's completely normal," Jessica assured her. "It takes time to build trust and establish new routines. I'm very patient with transitions." "Right. Well, I should be home by 6:30 at the latest. Charles will be here if you need anything urgent, but like I said, he's swamped with work." Victoria hesitated again, as if she wanted to say something else, but then simply waved goodbye to the children and disappeared into the garage. The sudden quiet that followed Victoria's departure felt almost deafening. Emma and Dylan stood in the entryway, looking at Jessica with expressions that seemed far too serious for children their ages. She had worked with enough families to recognize the signs of children who had learned to be cautious around adults, to wait and see what kind of person they were dealing with before opening up. "So," Jessica said with a bright smile, "what do you two usually do first thing in the morning? Do you have breakfast already, or should we get some food in your bellies before we start our adventures?" "We're not supposed to make noise before 9 o'clock, Emma said quietly. "Daddy doesn't like it when we're loud in the morning." Jessica glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was only 8:15. "Well, we can definitely be quiet. Maybe we could look at some books together, or we could whisper plan what we want to do later when it's okay to be a little louder." Dylan had wandered over to the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, pressing his nose against the glass. Can we go outside? Margaret never let us go outside. We'll definitely spend some time outside today, Jessica promised. First, let me get to know your house a little better so I can make sure you're safe wherever we play. As she began to explore the main floor with the children, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something about this family felt different from her usual clients. The house was beautiful but sterile, like a model home where people were afraid to actually live. The children were polite and well-behaved, but there was a careful quality to their behavior that suggested they had learned to be very aware of adult moods and expectations. She was examining the safety locks on the cabinets when she noticed the small, discreet cameras mounted in the corners of several rooms. Security cameras weren't unusual in wealthy homes, but something about the way they were positioned made her pause. They weren't just monitoring entry points or valuable items. They seemed designed to capture everything that happened in the main living spaces. Emma, sweetie, do those cameras record all the time? Or just when your parents aren't home? Jessica asked casually. Emma followed Jessica's gaze to the corner of the room. Daddy says they keep us safe. They're always watching. The way she said it, with such matter-of-fact acceptance, sent a small chill down Jessica's spine. She had worked in homes with security systems before, but there was something about this setup that felt more intrusive than protective. Still, she reminded herself that wealthy families often had elaborate security measures, and it wasn't her place to judge their choices. What she didn't realize was that those cameras were already recording every word of their conversation, capturing expressions and interactions that would later tell a story none of them could have anticipated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The grandfather clock in the Coleman's foyer chimed 9 o'clock, and Jessica felt the tension in the house shift almost immediately. Dylan, who had been sitting quietly beside her as they looked through picture books, suddenly perked up and began speaking in his normal voice instead of the careful whispers they'd been using. "Now we can be regular loud," he announced, jumping up from the couch with renewed energy. Emma remained more reserved, but Jessica noticed her shoulders relax slightly. "Would you like to see our playroom?" Emma asked. "It's upstairs, but we're allowed to play there during the day." Jessica followed the children up the carpeted staircase, noting family photos lining the walls, professional portraits of the four Colemans at various vacation destinations, always perfectly posed and smiling. At the top of the stairs, she could hear the muffled sound of Charles Coleman's voice coming from behind a closed door at the end of the hallway. His tone was sharp and authoritative, clearly conducting some kind of business call. The playroom was a stark contrast to the rest of the house's pristine appearance. Toys were scattered across colorful foam mats, art supplies covered a child-sized table, and books were stacked in somewhat haphazard piles. It was the first room Jessica had seen that actually looked like children lived in it. "This is much more like it," Jessica said warmly, settling cross-legged on the floor beside an elaborate train set. "Tell me about this train track. Did you build it yourself, Dylan?" Dylan beamed with pride and launched into an excited explanation of how each section connected, his earlier reserve completely forgotten. Emma joined them on the floor, though she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to appear and tell them to be quieter. As the morning progressed, Jessica began to understand the children's cautious behavior. Every time they got too enthusiastic about an activity, when Dylan's laughter grew too loud during a game of silly voices, or when Emma got excited about showing off her reading skills, they would automatically quiet themselves, their eyes darting toward the hallway. Around 10:30, Jessica heard Charles Coleman's office door open and his footsteps in the hallway. Both children immediately stopped what they were doing. Dylan, freezing mid-sentence while describing the castle they were building with blocks. "Good morning, kids," Charles's voice carried into the playroom before he appeared in the doorway. He was tall like his wife, with graying hair at his temples and wearing an expensive-looking button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His smile was polite, but didn't quite reach his eyes as they settled on Jessica. "You must be the new nanny. Jessica, right?" "Yes, Mr. Coleman, it's nice to meet you." Jessica stood up, extending her hand. His handshake was firm but brief, and she noticed how his gaze seemed to assess her in a way that made her slightly uncomfortable. "How are they behaving for you?" he asked, though his attention had already shifted to the scattered toys around the room. "I hope they're not giving you too much trouble." "Emma, sweetheart, remember what we talked about regarding keeping your things organized." Emma immediately began gathering blocks into their container, her movements quick and efficient. "Sorry, Daddy, we were just playing." "It's perfectly fine," Jessica interjected gently. "We're having a great time getting to know each other." "I was actually impressed with how creative they've been with their building projects." Charles nodded absently, checking his watch. "Well, I'll be in meetings most of the day, so try to keep the noise level manageable. Victoria mentioned you come highly recommended, so I'm sure you understand the importance of structure and discipline." There was something in his tone that made Jessica's professional instincts sharpen. She had worked with demanding parents before, but there was an underlying edge to Charles Coleman's words that felt more controlling than concerned. "Of course," Jessica replied evenly. "We'll be mindful of noise levels, especially during your work hours." After Charles returned to his office, Jessica noticed that the children's energy had deflated considerably. Emma went back to quietly organizing toys that had been perfectly fine scattered around, while Dylan sat beside his train set without the enthusiasm he'd shown earlier. "Hey," Jessica said softly, sitting back down with them. "How about we head outside for a while? It's a beautiful day, and I saw a really nice backyard from the kitchen window." The suggestion seemed to revitalize them both. They gathered their shoes and jackets, and Jessica led them through the sliding door into the Coleman's backyard. The space was as meticulously maintained as the interior, professional landscaping, a wooden playset that looked barely used, and a garden area with flowers planted in perfect rows. Outside, away from the house's oppressive quiet and the ever-present security cameras, the children began to act more like typical 6- and 4-year-olds. Dylan raced toward the swing set, while Emma showed Jessica the small vegetable garden where she'd apparently planted cherry tomatoes with Margaret. "The previous nanny, Margaret, helped me plant these last month," Emma said, touching the tiny green fruits growing on the vines. "She said we could make salads when they got bigger, but then she had to leave." "What happened with Margaret?" Jessica asked gently, crouching down to examine the tomato plants. "Dylan mentioned she was sad sometimes." Emma glanced back toward the house, then lowered her voice even though they were outside. "She used to cry in the bathroom. I heard her one day when I went to wash my hands. And sometimes she would get really quiet when Daddy talked to her." Jessica felt a knot forming in her stomach. "Did your daddy say mean things to her?" "Not mean exactly," Emma said thoughtfully, displaying wisdom beyond her years. "But the way he said things made her face look scared sometimes. Like when she accidentally broke the vase in the living room, and he asked her all these questions about whether she was being careless on purpose." Dylan had overheard their conversation and abandoned the swings to join them by the garden. "Margaret said our house had too many eyes," he announced matter-of-factly. I didn't know what she meant because houses don't have eyes, but Emma said she meant the cameras. Jessica's unease deepened. She had initially assumed the security cameras were simply a precaution wealthy families took, but the children's comments suggested something more troubling. The idea that a previous caregiver had felt so uncomfortable in this environment that she'd cried in bathrooms painted a very different picture of the Coleman household. "Did Margaret play outside with you like this?" Jessica asked, pushing Dylan on the swing, while Emma picked cherry tomatoes. "Sometimes," Emma replied, "but she always seemed worried about something. She kept looking at the house like she expected someone to come outside and tell us to go back in." Jessica followed Emma's gaze toward the house and noticed for the first time that there were cameras mounted under the eaves, positioned to capture the backyard as well. The level of surveillance was more extensive than she had initially realized, covering virtually every area where the family spent time. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "How is everything going?" The children can be quite a handful, especially Dylan with his energy levels. Don't hesitate to use timeouts if needed. Jessica frowned at the message. Dylan had been perfectly well behaved all morning. Energetic, yes, but not problematic in any way. If anything, both children seemed more subdued than she would expect for their ages. She was composing a response when Charles Coleman appeared at the sliding door. "Jessica, could I speak with you for a moment?" His tone was pleasant, but there was something commanding about it that made it clear this wasn't really a request. "Of course. Emma, Dylan, keep playing. I'll be right back." Jessica walked toward the house, noting how both children immediately became more subdued at their father's appearance. Charles held the door open for her, and she stepped into the kitchen, uncomfortably aware that they were now in full view of multiple security cameras. "I wanted to check in about how the morning went," Charles said, closing the door behind them. "The children can be challenging to manage, especially when they're adjusting to someone new. Victoria mentioned you're very experienced, but our family has specific expectations and routines that are important to maintain." "They've been wonderful," Jessica replied honestly. "Very well behaved and engaging. I haven't encountered any behavioral issues at all." Charles's expression shifted slightly, as if her answer wasn't what he'd expected. "Really? No defiance from Dylan? No attitude from Emma?" Margaret often mentioned having difficulties with their listening skills. Jessica felt increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "No, nothing like that. They've been cooperative and respectful all morning. They seem like genuinely good kids who just need age-appropriate activities and positive attention." Charles moved to the kitchen counter, ostensibly to get a glass of water, but his positioning meant Jessica had to turn away from the sliding door to face him, effectively cutting off her view of the children outside. "You know, we've had some challenges with previous caregivers not understanding our family's standards. Margaret, for instance, was often too permissive. She let the children get away with behavior that Victoria and I found unacceptable." "What kind of behavior?" Jessica asked, genuinely curious, but also sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere she didn't like. Questioning authority, talking back, not following instructions immediately. Children need firm boundaries, and sometimes that requires more assertive correction than some caregivers are comfortable providing. Charles's eyes met hers directly. "I hope you understand that maintaining discipline is a crucial part of this position." Jessica had worked with strict families before, but there was something in Charles's tone that made her instincts flare with warning signals. The way he spoke about assertive correction and his emphasis on immediate obedience suggested expectations that might conflict with her. "Professional ethics regarding child welfare, I believe in age-appropriate boundaries and consistent expectations," Jessica replied carefully. "But I also believe in positive reinforcement and helping children understand the reasoning behind rules rather than demanding blind obedience." Charles's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Of course, I'm sure we'll find a good balance. Why don't you get back to the children? And Jessica, I'd appreciate it if our conversation stayed between us. Victoria gets anxious when she thinks we're micromanaging the childcare arrangements." As Jessica walked back toward the sliding door, she felt increasingly certain that she was walking into a situation far more complex and potentially problematic than a simple nanny position. The children's subdued behavior, the extensive surveillance system, the previous nanny's apparent distress, and now Charles's thinly veiled instructions about discipline were painting a picture that made her professional instincts scream. And warnings. What she didn't know was that every word of their kitchen conversation had been captured by the security cameras, recorded in high definition, along with the subtle expressions and body language that would later reveal the true nature of what was happening in the Coleman household. Outside, Emma and Dylan were waiting for her by the tomato plants. their faces showing a mixture of concern and resignation that no children their age should have to display. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Coleman's living room as Jessica helped Emma with a puzzle while Dylan constructed an elaborate city out of wooden blocks. The house had settled into a deceptive calm, with Charles's muffled voice occasionally drifting from his office upstairs, punctuated by the sound of phones ringing and keyboards clicking. Jessica had just begun to relax when her phone rang. Victoria Coleman's name appeared on the screen, and something in Jessica's gut told her this wasn't going to be a routine check-in call. "Hello, Mrs. Coleman," Jessica answered, stepping into the kitchen for privacy while keeping the children in sight. "Jessica, I'm calling because Charles mentioned there might be some concerns about this afternoon." Victoria's voice was crisp and businesslike, but there was an underlying tension that made Jessica immediately alert. "He said the children were being particularly difficult during outdoor time." Jessica blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some miscommunication. The children have been excellent all day. We had a wonderful time outside, and they've been cooperative and engaged with every activity." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you certain?" Charles specifically mentioned that Dylan was having trouble following directions and that Emma was being argumentative about coming inside. "That absolutely did not happen," Jessica said firmly but politely. "Dylan has been energetic but completely appropriate for his age, and Emma has been helpful and well-mannered all day. In fact, they both came inside willingly when I suggested we work on indoor activities." Another pause. Jessica could hear office sounds in the background. Victoria was clearly calling from work, which made this conversation even more unusual. Why would Charles have called his wife at work to report behavioral problems that hadn't occurred? "I see," Victoria said finally. "Well, perhaps there was some confusion. Charles has been under a lot of stress with his current projects, so maybe he misinterpreted normal childhood energy as defiance." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't confusion, this was deliberate misrepresentation. But why would Charles Coleman lie about the children's behavior to their mother? "Mrs. Coleman, I want to assure you that both Emma and Dylan are wonderful children. They're bright, creative, and well-behaved. If there are specific concerns about their behavior or my caregiving approach, I'd be happy to discuss them openly." No, that won't be necessary," Victoria replied quickly. "I trust your professional judgment. Perhaps Charles well, as I said, he's been stressed. I'll speak with him about it later." After ending the call, Jessica returned to the living room where both children were quietly engaged in their activities. But she noticed they kept glancing at her with worried expressions, and she realized they had likely overheard enough of the conversation to understand that something was wrong. "Miss Jessica," Emma said quietly, setting down a puzzle piece, "are we in trouble?" The question broke Jessica's heart. These children had clearly learned to expect blame and criticism even when they'd done nothing wrong. "You are not in trouble at all, sweetheart. You and Dylan have been absolutely perfect today." "But Daddy called Mommy," Dylan observed, with the uncanny perceptiveness that children often display. "He only calls Mommy at work when something bad happens." Jessica knelt down beside them, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes adults have misunderstandings about things, but I want you both to know that I think you're amazing kids, and nothing about that is going to change." Emma's eyes filled with tears she was clearly trying not to shed. "Margaret said we were good kids too, but Daddy always told Mommy we were bad when she wasn't here." The pieces of a disturbing puzzle began falling into place in Jessica's mind. Margaret, the previous nanny, had reportedly left due to a family emergency, but what if that wasn't the whole truth? What if she'd been driven away by a pattern of false accusations and manufactured conflicts? "Can I tell you something?" Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I think the cameras are there so Daddy can watch us and find things wrong, even when we're being good." Jessica felt a surge of protective anger on behalf of these children. She had encountered difficult parents before, even manipulative ones, but this felt like something more systematic and cruel. The extensive surveillance system, the previous nanny's distress, Charles's immediate attempt to create a false narrative about the children's behavior. It all pointed to a pattern of psychological manipulation that was affecting everyone in this household. "Emma, Dylan," Jessica said gently, "I want you to remember something important. You are both good children. You're kind, smart, creative, and well-behaved. If any adult tells you otherwise, that's their problem, not yours." At that moment, they heard Charles's office door open upstairs, followed by heavy footsteps on the staircase. Both children immediately tensed, and Jessica watched in dismay as they quickly began cleaning up their activities without being asked, moving with the efficient urgency of children who had learned that adult displeasure could strike at any moment. Charles appeared in the living room doorway, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. "How are things going down here?" he asked with false cheerfulness. "I hope the afternoon has been more manageable than this morning." Jessica stood up slowly, meeting his gaze directly. "The afternoon has been lovely, just like the morning. The children are being wonderful, really." Charles's eyebrows raised in apparent surprise. "That's unexpected. Usually they get more restless as the day goes on. Especially Dylan. He tends to have trouble controlling his impulses after lunch." Dylan, who was carefully placing blocks back in their container, looked up at his father with an expression of hurt confusion. "But Daddy, I've been good today. Miss Jessica said so. Did she now?" Charles's tone remained pleasant, but there was something sharp underneath it. "Well, Miss Jessica hasn't been here very long yet. Sometimes it takes a while to recognize the signs of brewing behavioral problems." Jessica felt her professional composure being tested. "Mr. Coleman, I've been working with children for 8 years. Dylan has shown no signs of behavioral problems whatsoever. He's been engaged, cooperative, and age-appropriately energetic throughout the entire day." Charles's smile became more strained. "I'm sure you think you know what you're seeing, but these children can be quite manipulative when they want to be. They put on good behavior for new caregivers, but it never lasts long." Emma had stopped organizing her puzzle pieces and was staring at her father with an expression that was far too mature for her 6 years. "Daddy, why do you always say we're bad when we're not being bad?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Jessica watched Charles's mask slip for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath his paternal facade. "Emma, sweetheart, that's not a very respectful way to talk to your father," he said. But his voice had taken on an edge that made Jessica's skin crawl. "Perhaps this is exactly the kind of attitude Miss Jessica isn't recognizing yet." "Actually," Jessica interjected firmly, "that was a perfectly reasonable question from a child who's trying to understand inconsistent adult behavior." Emma was respectful in her tone and simply asking for clarification. Charles turned his attention fully to Jessica, and she could see him reassessing her as a potential threat to whatever game he was playing. "You seem to have very strong opinions about child psychology for someone who's been here less than 8 hours. I have strong opinions about treating children fairly and accurately, representing their behavior," Jessica replied evenly. "That's part of providing quality childcare." The tension in the room was palpable. Emma had moved closer to Dylan, and both children were watching the adult conversation, with the wary attention of kids who had learned that these exchanges often determined their immediate fate. Charles glanced at the security, cameras in the corners of the room, and Jessica caught the gesture. Was he thinking about how this conversation was being recorded? Was he planning to use edited footage to support whatever narrative he wanted to create? "Well," Charles said finally, "I suppose we'll see how things develop over time. Children can be quite good at fooling people initially." He checked his watch with theatrical precision. "I need to get back to my calls. Victoria should be home within the hour." As Charles headed back upstairs, Jessica realized she was facing a decision that would define not just her employment, but potentially her integrity as a childcare professional. She could play along with Charles Coleman's apparent need to paint his children as problematic, or she could stand firm in her assessment of what she was actually observing. What she didn't know was that the security cameras had captured every nuance of their interaction, including Charles's calculated expressions when he thought no one was watching, and the children's fearful responses to their father's manipulation. The footage was building a record that would soon reveal the true dynamics of the Coleman household in ways that no one could have anticipated. Emma tugged gently on Jessica's sleeve. "Miss Jessica, are you going to leave like Margaret did?" The question cut straight to Jessica's heart, because she realized that these children had learned to expect abandonment from the adults who were supposed to protect and care for them. Victoria Coleman's silver BMW pulled into the driveway at exactly 6:28. And Jessica watched through the front window as the woman sat in her car for several minutes, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly at someone on the other end of the call. Even from a distance, Jessica could see the tension in Victoria's posture, shoulders rigid, free hand gripping the steering wheel. Emma and Dylan had been unusually quiet for the past hour, as if they could sense their mother's impending arrival and were bracing themselves for whatever mood she might bring home. They'd finished their dinner, simple grilled cheese sandwiches and apple slices that Jessica had prepared, and were now sitting at the kitchen table, coloring with an intensity that seemed more like anxiety management than creative expression. "Is Mommy mad?" Dylan asked without looking up from his drawing of what appeared to be a house with no windows. "I don't know, sweetheart," Jessica answered honestly. "But whatever mood she's in when she comes inside, it's not because of anything you two did. You've been perfect angels today." Emma set down her crayon and looked directly at Jessica. "Will you tell her that? Sometimes the things Daddy says make her think we were bad, even when we weren't." Before Jessica could respond, they heard the garage door opening, followed by the click of Victoria's heels on the kitchen tiles. She entered through the connecting door, her professional facade firmly in place. But Jessica could see the strain around her eyes. "Hello, everyone," Victoria said, setting her briefcase down with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. "How did everything go today?" Jessica stood up, smoothing her cardigan and preparing for what she suspected would be a carefully orchestrated conversation. "It went wonderfully. Emma and Dylan were both excellent company, and we had a really productive day together." Victoria's smile was polite, but didn't reach her eyes as she glanced between Jessica and the children. "That's good to hear." Charles mentioned there might have been some challenges this afternoon. "Actually, there weren't any challenges at all," Jessica replied calmly. "The children were cooperative, engaged, and well-behaved throughout the entire day. I'm not sure why Mr. Coleman would have suggested otherwise. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees." Victoria's expression shifted to something Jessica couldn't quite read: surprise, confusion, or perhaps something more complicated. "I see," Victoria said slowly. "Emma, Dylan, why don't you go upstairs and get ready for your baths? I need to speak with Miss Jessica privately." The children gathered their coloring supplies with the same efficient urgency Jessica had observed earlier, and she noticed how they avoided making eye contact with their mother as they filed past her toward the staircase. Emma paused at the doorway and looked back at Jessica with an expression that seemed to say, "Please don't abandon us." Once the children's footsteps had faded upstairs, Victoria poured herself a large glass of wine from a bottle in the refrigerator and took a long sip before turning to face Jessica. "I have to ask you directly," Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled, "and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did anything happen today that I should know about? Any behavioral issues? Any problems with the children following directions? Anything that might have concerned Charles?" Jessica chose her words carefully, sensing that she was navigating a minefield of family politics and hidden agendas. "Mrs. Coleman, I've been working with children for 8 years, and I pride myself on accurate and honest communication with parents. Your children were genuinely well-behaved today. They were creative, respectful, and age-appropriately energetic. I saw no behavioral problems whatsoever." Victoria took another sip of wine, and Jessica noticed her hand was trembling slightly. Then why would Charles call me 3 separate times at work today to discuss their behavior problems? The revelation hit Jessica like a physical blow. 3 phone calls? She had only overheard one conversation between Victoria and her husband, which meant Charles had made additional calls to report fictional incidents. Mrs. Coleman, I can only tell you what I observed. And what I observed was 2 lovely children who were eager to please and genuinely enjoyable to spend time with. If Mr. Coleman reported specific incidents, I'd be happy to address them directly, because I can assure you they didn't happen in my presence. Victoria set her wineglass down and began pacing the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile floor. This doesn't make sense. Charles specifically told me that Dylan had a meltdown around 2 o'clock and that Emma was being disrespectful about cleaning up her toys. Jessica felt her professional composure beginning to crack. Mrs. Coleman, at 2 o'clock, Dylan was peacefully building with blocks in the playroom while Emma read a book beside him. There was no meltdown, no disrespectful behavior, and no problems with cleaning up. In fact, both children cleaned up their activities without even being asked. But why would Charles and Victoria trailed off, and Jessica watched as understanding began to dawn in the woman's eyes. It was a painful realization, the kind that forced someone to confront uncomfortable truths about their own family. At that moment, Charles appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Jessica realized he must have been listening to their conversation from the hallway. His expression was pleasant and concerned, but there was something predatory in his eyes that made Jessica's skin crawl. "Ladies, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he said smoothly. "I just wanted to check in about how we're planning to handle the behavioral challenges moving forward." "Charles," Victoria said. Turning to face her husband, Jessica says there weren't any behavioral challenges today. She says the children were perfectly well behaved. Charles's expression shifted to one of patronizing concern. "Oh, Victoria, you know how these things go. New caregivers often miss the subtle signs of brewing problems. Children can be very good at masking their defiant behavior when they're testing boundaries with someone new." Jessica felt something snap inside her. "Mr. Coleman, I need to be very clear about something. I did not miss any behavioral problems because there were no behavioral problems to miss. Your children were polite, cooperative, and delightful to work with. Any suggestion otherwise is simply not accurate." The kitchen fell silent except for the of the refrigerator and the distant sound of water. Running upstairs where the children were, presumably getting ready for their baths. Charles's mask slipped completely for a moment, and Jessica saw something cold and calculating in his expression that confirmed her worst. Suspicions about what was happening in this household. "I see we have a difference of professional opinion," Charles said with forced lightness. "Perhaps Jessica simply has different standards for acceptable behavior than we do." "Or perhaps," Jessica replied steadily, "you have unrealistic expectations for children and a tendency to create problems where none exist." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Jessica realized she had just crossed a line that would fundamentally change her relationship with this family. Victoria was staring at her husband with an expression of dawning horror, while Charles looked like a man who had been caught in a lie but was still calculating his next move. "I think," Charles said slowly, "that we may need to reconsider whether this arrangement is working out for everyone involved." Jessica felt a surge of protective fury on behalf of Emma and Dylan, who were upstairs preparing for bed while the adults discussed their fate based on fabricated behavioral problems. "Mr. Coleman, the only arrangement that isn't working is one where children are falsely accused of problems they didn't create and caregivers are expected to participate in that fiction." Victoria set her wineglass down with shaking hands. "Charles, I need to understand something. Are you telling me that you called me 3 times at work today to report behavioral problems that didn't actually happen?" Charles's expression hardened. "Victoria, I think you're letting this woman manipulate you into doubting my judgment about our own." children. But Jessica could see that Victoria was beginning to connect dots that painted a disturbing picture of her family dynamics. The woman's face was pale, and she kept glancing toward the staircase where her children were getting ready for bed, probably listening to every word of the adult conversation that was determining their immediate future. "I need some air," Victoria said suddenly, walking toward the sliding door that led to the backyard. "Charles, we're going to finish this conversation outside." As the couple stepped onto the patio, Jessica could see them through the glass door, their body language tense and confrontational. Charles was gesturing emphatically, while Victoria stood with her arms crossed, shaking her head. Whatever was being said out there, it was clear that Jessica's honesty had forced a reckoning that had been building in this household for some time. Upstairs, she could hear the children's voices, Emma helping Dylan with something, probably getting him into his pajamas. They were being so careful to stay quiet, clearly aware that their parents were having an intense discussion about their behavior and their future care. Jessica realized that in less than 24 hours, she had become an unwitting catalyst in a family crisis that had been brewing long before her arrival. The security cameras that monitored every room had captured all of it. Charles's manipulative behavior, the children's fearful responses, Victoria's growing awareness of the truth, and Jessica's refusal to participate in a system designed to gaslight everyone involved. None of them knew was that the cameras had also captured something else. Moments when Charles thought no one was watching. Expressions and actions that revealed the true extent of his psychological manipulation of his own family. Jessica stood in Coleman's kitchen, watching through the glass door as Victoria and Charles engaged in what appeared to be the most heated argument of their marriage. Their voices were muffled, but their body language told the story clearly. Victoria's hands were shaking as she pointed accusingly at her husband, while Charles's face had taken on the cold, calculating expression Jessica had glimpsed throughout the day. Upstairs, the house had gone completely quiet. Emma and Dylan had finished their bath routine and were likely huddled together in one of their bedrooms, listening to their parents fight about them through the floor vents. Jessica's heart ached for these children who had learned to make themselves invisible. Whenever adult tensions escalated, she was startling to realize just how extensively this family's dysfunction ran when her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Margaret Chen, the previous nanny. I heard through the Henderson family that you're working for the Colemans. Please call me. It's important." Jessica glanced toward the patio where Victoria and Charles were still in intense discussion, then quietly stepped into the powder room off the main hallway and dialed the number. "Thank God you called." Margaret's voice was urgent and slightly breathless. "How long have you been there?" "Just today." "It's my first day," Jessica whispered, keeping one ear tuned to the sounds of the house. "Listen to me carefully," Margaret said. "I didn't leave because of a family emergency. I left because Charles Coleman was systematically documenting false behavioral reports about the children and trying to get me to sign off on them. When I refused, he started making recordings of edited conversations that made it sound like I was agreeing with his assessment of Emma and Dylan as problem children." Jessica felt the blood drain from her face. "What kind of recordings?" "He has access to all the security footage, and he knows how to edit it to create narratives that didn't actually happen. He would take a clip of me saying, 'Yes, Mr. Coleman,' in response to a question about lunch preferences and splice it together with audio of him describing behavioral problems, making it sound like I was confirming incidents that never occurred. But why would he do that to his own children?" Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. "I think he gets some kind of satisfaction from having complete control over everyone's reality. Victoria works such long hours that she relies on his reports about what happens at home. The children have learned to expect blame and criticism no matter how well-behaved they are, and caregivers like us become complicit in his narrative, or we get driven out." Jessica could hear Victoria's voice rising on the patio, and Charles's response was sharp and defensive. The confrontation was escalating rapidly. Margaret, did you ever find out what he did with those edited recordings? I discovered he was keeping files, documents that painted Emma and Dylan as having behavioral disorders, learning disabilities, emotional problems. I think he was building a case for something, though I never figured out what. When I threatened to report him to Child Protective Services, he told me that no one would believe me over a successful businessman, and that he had hours of recorded evidence of the children's problems and my inadequate response to them. Jessica felt sick. She thought about Emma's question earlier. Will you tell her that we're good kids? These children were living in a psychological prison where their father systematically distorted reality to maintain control over everyone around him. There's something else, Margaret continued. Check the cameras in the house. I discovered that several of them are positioned to capture audio from the children's bedrooms and bathroom areas. That level of surveillance isn't about security. It's about control and documentation. At that moment, Jessica heard the sliding door open and Victoria's heels clicking across the kitchen floor. I have to go, she whispered into the phone. But thank you for calling. Victoria appeared in the powder room doorway, her face flushed and her carefully styled hair disheveled. Jessica, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. In your professional opinion, do my children show signs of behavioral disorders or psychological problems? Jessica looked directly into Victoria's eyes. Your children show signs of being afraid of their father's unpredictable criticism and having learned to expect adult displeasure even when they've done nothing wrong. Other than that adaptive anxiety, they are psychologically healthy, emotionally intelligent, and behaviorally appropriate children. Victoria's face crumpled, and Jessica realized that this woman had been living with her own version of her husband's gaslighting. Charles has been telling me for months that they were getting worse, that Margaret was too soft on them, that they needed more structured discipline. He's been showing me video clips of them having episodes that I never witnessed myself. Mrs. Coleman, children don't have behavioral episodes in a vacuum. If Emma and Dylan were having the kinds of problems your husband described, I would have seen evidence of them within hours. Instead, I saw two well-adjusted kids who were eager to please and delighted to have positive adult attention. Charles appeared in the kitchen behind Victoria, his face a mask of cold fury. I couldn't help but overhear this fascinating conversation about my children's mental health. Jessica, I think it's time for you to leave. Actually, Victoria said, turning to face her husband with steel in her voice, I think it's time for some honest answers. I want to see the original footage from today's cameras, not edited clips or your interpretations. I want to see exactly what happened while I was at work. Charles's expression shifted to one of patronizing concern. Victoria, you're clearly upset and not thinking rationally. This woman has been here for one day, and she's already convinced you to doubt your own husband's observations about your own children. Show me the footage. Charles, the footage will just confirm what I've been telling you. Jessica missed the behavioral problems because she's either inexperienced or she's choosing to ignore them to make herself look good. Jessica stepped forward. Mr. Coleman, I invite you to review every moment of today's footage. You'll see children who cleaned up without being asked, who played cooperatively, who followed every instruction immediately, and who showed no signs of defiance, aggression, or behavioral problems whatsoever. Charles's mask slipped completely, revealing something ugly underneath. You have no idea what you're interfering with here. This family has systems and expectations that you couldn't possibly understand in a single day. I understand that you've been systematically lying about your children's behavior and creating a false narrative that serves no one except your need for control, Jessica said firmly. The kitchen fell deadly silent. Victoria was staring at her husband with growing horror, while Charles looked like a man whose entire manipulative structure was collapsing around him. Victoria, Charles said slowly, if you choose to believe this woman over your own husband, There will be consequences for this family that you can't imagine. Is that a threat, Charles? Before he could answer, Emma appeared at the top of the staircase in her pajamas, having clearly been listening to the entire conversation. Mommy, we're not bad kids. Miss Jessica is telling the truth. We were good today, and we're good every day, but Daddy always says we're bad anyway. Dylan appeared beside his sister, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Are you going to leave like Margaret did, Miss Jessica? Jessica felt her heart break as she looked at these children who had learned to expect abandonment from every adult who tried to advocate for them. She walked to the bottom of the staircase and looked up at them. Emma, Dylan, I want you to remember something very important. You are good children. You are kind, smart, creative, and well-behaved. Any adult who tells you otherwise is wrong, and that's their problem, not yours. She turned back to Victoria and Charles. I will not be returning tomorrow. Not because your children are problematic, but because they deserve to live in a household where their reality is respected and their natural goodness is recognized rather than systematically denied. As Jessica gathered her things and headed toward the front door, she heard Emma call down from the staircase, Miss Jessica, will you remember that we were good today? I will always remember, Jessica replied, and someday everyone else will remember too. What Jessica didn't know as she left the Coleman house that evening was that the security cameras had captured something Charles hadn't anticipated. In his fury during the final confrontation, he had forgotten that the cameras were still recording when he made subtle, threatening gestures toward the children, when he revealed his knowledge of footage editing techniques, and when his mask of paternal concern slipped to reveal the calculating manipulator underneath. The next morning, Victoria Coleman would review the unedited footage from Jessica's single day of employment. She would see her children's natural joy when they played outside, their immediate anxiety whenever their father appeared, and Charles's cold expressions when he thought no one was watching. She would hear him making false reports about incidents that never occurred, and she would finally understand that her husband had been systematically gaslighting their entire family. 3 weeks later, Margaret Chen and Jessica Martinez would provide testimony to family court about the psychological manipulation they had witnessed in the Coleman household. The unedited security footage that Charles had installed to maintain control over his family would become the evidence that finally freed Emma and Dylan from his distorted version of reality. Sometimes, the cameras designed to hide the truth end up being the very thing that reveals it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.